Hey guys, it's me, Stormie, and today we are going to talk a little bit about the Uranus signs. And truly, some people call it Uranus, but if you ask an ancient astrologer or a person who's been doing astrology for a long time, they're going to tell you that the planet is called Uranus. And that just is what it is, team, okay? So say it however it makes you happy, but that just is what it is. Now, when we look at the planet, as a whole, first of all, it is the ruler of Aquarius, one of them, which is such a beautiful thing because we know how incredibly innovative, right, that the Aquarians are. They take us forward. They take mankind and humankind forward. They look at tradition and they're like, I don't need your stinking traditions, right? And they just kind of bust out of those things. It's a very progressive planet. It's a very progressive sign. But when we look at the planet as a whole and we look at what the sign means in the individual chart, it's great because it's also a space of enlightenment. It really is. This is a highly intuitive placement because literally think about where we are and what we're experiencing right now. It's this mix between the head and the heart, right? And the heart at that intuitive level is trying to drive you forward. It's trying to progress. And as you stay in the flow, it can literally feel like you are breaking down barriers of your life, like you're becoming this absolute person that you're supposed to be, like you're doing it different. You're coming at things in your life from a different angle with a different perspective. You know what I mean? That's really what this is about. Now, when we look at what happens when people are not developing and going against that Uranus sign and not helping it grow, it can feel like you have chaos in your life. It can feel like you have sudden chaos in your life. It is literally like the universe hits you in the face with the biggest boxing glove ever. That's really, when I'm looking at a whole bunch of chaos in someone's life, I'm going to look at where they're at in their development of this sign placement. Now, like I said, to the other side of this, when you're really growing in it and you're allowing the development to happen, it can feel like liberation, which that's what this sign is about. Rebellion and breaking free and doing it different, liberating kind of energy. Now, one thing to keep in mind, it's kind of funny to think about it in terms of a planetary movement, but since Uranus moves so slowly, literally, this is not a quick moving planet. By the time it gets to an opposite placement in your birth chart, you usually are about 40 years old. So isn't that when we see it? We have these like midlife crisis, right? Because it's like, oh my God, this whole show has got to be different. I'm no longer built to live life the way that I was. I want to do it this way. It needs to be this way. And it feels like a calling. Your Uranus sign feels like a calling, I promise you. So you may look into your chart and you may say, man, I really got to make some changes here, or I feel called to make some changes here. And that's really your Uranus sign partially at work there. It calls you, it gives you the courage, right? And really, I mean, when we think about the words that describe the Uranus sign, because the Uranus sign is going to shake some things up for you, right? It's going to shake up things in your life. And then it may be, depending on your planet, it may make you the person who's going to shake things up in the world. So this sign is very much so, we use words like independence, surprise, rebellion. Like we know that whenever Uranus is around, we never quite know what we're going to expect, right? Awakening, enlightenment, all of these things describe the Uranus sign. So now if you would like to know what your Uranus sign placement means specifically for you, but in a general way, feel free to stay tuned. Oftentimes when we see people with the Uranus in Aries placement, this is a placement that is very original, full of ambition, full of energy. They're very resourceful. Things that are challenging to other people, they're like, whatever, I got this, right? But the thing is this is a really impulsive sign placement. They can be impulsive. Their personalities can be very abrupt, and it can actually make them very, very hard to get along with because they can come off as know-it-alls, like they know everything. There's nothing that they need to learn, which is really interesting because they do like to go back to school, or they do like to go into learning situations. And these are sometimes the people that you see where you're like, you seem like such a, a calm person, and then we put you in this environment and you know everything, so you're like better than the teacher, even though this is like, life 101 or whatever the class is. We've all been around these people. And in fact, they tend to lose friends and have rough relationships because of this placement, especially if they're not growing and developing. Their chance to use this placement to actually help create innovation and help create new structures going forward, because they're absolutely beautiful at making new plans, making new signs, and also implementing them. They generally have a great sense of business, a great sense of finance, and it really comes in handy through their whole life. And if they can kind of combine all of that with the rest of the things going on in their sign placement, they can really make moves. Now, like I said, in an undeveloped or a foolish placement of this, or a foolish use of this placement, this can go either way. It's a very 50-50 kind of placement. They can really have where they have healing talents and they help take the world forward, and they really do it in a much more quick way than, say, somebody with Uranus and Cancer is going to do. But they can also be very, very destructive. They can lead full-on genocide type of rebellions. It's a very interesting placement that can go either way. But if you have this placement, I'm sure you know a little bit of what I'm talking about, and it's always about the growth and the development here, and also empowering what's beautiful about this placement so that you can move it forward to maximize your use of the energy in your life and in the lives of the people around you. The Uranus and Taurus placement can be so stubborn. Oh my gosh, which is so crazy, because it's like once they set their mind to something, that's it in this placement. And it is generally very innovative. They are like, I am going to change this whatever, or I am going to construct this whatever. And then they stick to it. And I mean, they can plod along with their feet very much so stuck in the mud, but they still persist and they still keep going. It's absolutely incredible. And for this reason, this is one of those placements where they can actually do very, very well for themselves financially, which is interesting because just as well, if they get stuck in it, they can have some serious financial repercussions and issues that happen at the same well. And it all arises out of this stubbornness. That stubbornness can also create issues in relationships because it can make them suspicious or jealous, and once they are suspicious or jealous, they don't hide it well. You can really tell this about them. But the thing is to the upside of that, they really can have amazing relationships because they're incredibly loyal and they're always willing to watch the relationship move forward. This is another reason I think that they are great in partnerships, and also they do well in things like real estate and things like that, where the market can change and shift, but really for the most part, houses are houses, you know what I mean? And they learn it better, and they just really stick with it. It's a really interesting placement. Not to mention, because they are able to just be so grounded and so in one place and persistent, they're incredibly resourceful. And because they are resourceful, because they've had time to stop and look around at everything, take the value in and figure out how to use it, it helps them overcome all kinds of different obstacles and issues and things like that. Now, what's interesting about this placement as well, because Uranus is erratic and unexpected, even though this Taurus energy is very fixed, you can be hanging with them and they are easygoing, they're chill, they're stubborn, but they're hanging out, they're in a good space, and then all of a sudden you say something to them and it's like, boom, you've got the most rigid person ever, and they're very conservative and they are just not feeling it. It's not going to happen. It's a really interesting switch to watch this. Now, when they do work, when you watch these people work, it's generally really hard to get them started on a project. It's generally hard to get this placement moving and going, but once they do, they get started, they get going, and they're usually pretty good. Now, you'll see the power in these people in short bursts, right? They'll work on a project forever, and then in small bursts, it's like they're really working on the project. They're like, they got it, they got the zing, and it's happening, right? And then in other ones, it's like, yeah, they're working, but yeah, it's happening. Now, one thing I will tell you about this placement is they typically have very psychic abilities. They can very much so intune and enlighten a little bit differently than some of the other sign placements can. So it's really kind of an honor and a gift to watch these people work when they really dig in and tune into that psychicness and help it develop. And that's the other reason they tend to hold their psychic abilities, is because they dig in and do the work to make sure they're staying open and connected and working. Uranus and Gemini, man, these are some seriously versatile people. They're usually intuitive. They are Man, they are our social change leaders because these people are happy to talk about ideas that maybe society's not ready to accept yet, but they're happy to voice them and put them out there. And then, you know, like we see in the 40s, we see in the 60s, these movements were led by people who had Uranus and Gemini, these huge social movements. So they're really, really interesting people. Now, one thing about them, because they are incredibly diverse and versatile conversationalists, they communicate well, they grasp new ideas very, very well. They typically really like things that have to do with aviation. They like to fly, imagine that. Sciences, things that are electronic in nature, things like that. They're very, very good at psychology. Even I think some occult and some astrology things, you find people with really good placements here as well. And they may they can go either way. They can be the people who are so liked and they're so popular, or they're at least known because just of their natural versatile nature, but they can also be, if they are not developing that Uranus placement, an annoyance. They can be awful to be around when they're like that because they too take on a very know-it-all kind of attitude about everything. The other thing that this placement really has to watch and learn and develop into is, with all of this communication style available to them and gathering all of these pieces of information and these concepts very, very well, they have to develop a very intuitive and very sincere soul level form of communication, because when they communicate, they can very much so communicate like a book, and they can be passionate about communicating like the book. And what it lacks is the sincerity. What it lacks is that human understanding that can come with it. So in it, watching this development, it's beautiful to watch these people develop this placement because they really can promote change. They can promote change in people as long as they don't remain too logical. Uranus in Cancer, this is a really interesting placement because in this placement, they naturally want to be at home and do domestic things and take care of the domestic situation. And sometimes they even, it's like they break new ground in domestic living. These are often some of the people who are like, God, do you know what would be really great in a house is if we had this thing that like sucked up things from the carpet. Oh, we know that today. That's a vacuum, right? And they don't even mean to like create these things where they created something that everybody benefits from. It's just because they like doing what they're doing. At the same time, I say it's so interesting because while they like and typically want to do all of these domestic things, they usually have awful relationships with their families. They usually have lots of childhood insecurities that come up later in life. And it's like when they are with their families, they really can't help but be the drama creator, and it's because they're so highly sensitive to all sorts of energies and generally very psychic and can really breathe them in. So instead of having this kind of energy in this placement where it's like I'm with my family and yes, everybody has their own ish and everybody thinks what they think, but we are all ultimately growing together, where they can get trapped is in the energy themselves, and then they take it personally, they breathe it in, and it makes them erratic, it makes them irrational. It can put them in a place where they're very prone to hysterics. Now, at the same time, when this is being developed, this Uranus in Cancer placement can be one that helps other people who've had childhood issues, who have domestic issues, help them see how to get to the other side. I mean, it is absolutely not unexpected and not uncommon for this kind of placement to, have a family, join a family, like get married, do all of those things, and then to divorce later because it's like, I actually don't really enjoy being with people even though I really want to. Other things that we can see in our common of this placement that I see plenty is that they can have issues with property. They can have issues with land or development and things like that. But like I said, in a development of this placement, man, they sure do help other people who have this placement really grow and be in a position where it's like, okay, this is how we handle these social relationships, and this is how you protect that psychic energy so that you're not prone to hysterics. It's a really psychic, beautiful placement, but it is a placement that, my goodness, has some emotional work to it. If you have this placement, you probably definitely know what I'm talking about, especially if you're still in the growth and development. So when we're looking at the Uranus in Leo placement, this can be such an impatient and rebellious, but very much so genius kind of placement. I mean, I have to tell you, this placement typically is not real hot on traditions, you know what I mean? They have strong personalities, they are assertive. Often, honestly, this placement can rub people really the wrong way, and it's just kind of like, but they are these people, they are like educational and journalistic giants, because they are not afraid to go get the real story. They're not afraid to go just flip the world upside down with information, especially if it's true. And it's nice because, like, we really do, when we look into certain journalists that are present right now in the world, we can really see that their attack with this kind of placement in their chart leads them to getting some of the most delicious stories that are out there. Now, with this placement as well, when we look at other areas besides work and career and stuff like that, they can be very inconsistent when it comes to love. I mean, like, they start one relationship before they've ended the next and things like that. But it's fun. If you've never been courted by somebody who has this placement, you've truly missed out, because they generally have some of the most romantic and indulgent and just far-fetched kind of courtships. It's really actually very fun. But the thing is that you know, they get bored with it, they court the hell out of you, and then it's like, okay, I'm on to the next adventure. So they do like to be distinguished. They're natural leaders. This placement really, I mean, they have a, oh, Doodle's stressed. They have a strange need to be ahead of the game at no matter what cost. So often a lesson that comes with this Uranus placement is about self-mastery and how not to harm others. So they end up learning in there that in their attempts to like gain spotlight and things like that, they need to not do it to their detriment. So really interesting and fun placement though, but definitely willing to flip the world upside down for information. So, When we see the Uranus and Virgo placement, this placement is, first of all, just genius. I mean, they typically are strong in science or in health or in healing, things like that, especially true to Virgo nature. They're very good and have healing hands that are great with the soil. So it's this place of looking for new techniques of healing and things like that. And that they typically have usually strong minds for business as well. These people can be found in government or things that are in the public eye, because in this placement as well, even though they're always willing to rebel and do it different, on the surface they look so well put together and everybody's like, oh, they have their tacos in a row. Meanwhile, it's the underneath part, that raging river that wants to know the new stuff, wants to know the newest technology, wants to know the best way to help clean the earth, wants to know the best way to help take care of the earth and things like that. And it's always this mix between these two energies here of Uranus being so rebellious and Virgo being so grounded and being like, one thing at a time, that it's like, when it comes right down to it, they are this mix between technology that rebels and pushes us forward because it's brand new and it's the newest thing out, and the ancient teachings which say you don't need technology, just get your hands in the dirt. So it's always this kind of push-pull with this kind of energy, but really when we watch it work together, it's brilliant. Now, one thing that this placement also tends to struggle with is that they usually have a lot of ailments. This can be a very hypochondriac kind of placement, but it's because that's just their nature. I mean, you have to think, you take Virgo, who's ruled by the parasympathetic nerve systems, right? And got all of that going on, and pair it with Uranus, who's like, every 5 minutes, you would be freaked out about your life as well. You know what I'm saying? So as long as in this placement, they can kind of ground down, work on one thing in their life at a time, try and find the very best fit and solution for it, then they are going to be great. And as long as they keep their life in service to mankind, they're usually pretty strong and pretty successful as well. Now, the Uranus and Libra placement can be very diplomatic, and usually they're very artsy, gifted in either literature or music or art itself. And I mean, even when you see them, there's a distinction about them. Either they're wearing a very distinct color, and not even that it's like loud or anything like that. It could just be very distinct as to how they are wearing it or things like that. But you know their personality, and they when you see them, they're quite charming. It's a quite charming placement, and it's kind of like a blessing. Like you feel like you're like in the midst of an intuitively blessed kind of person, right? And they really do. Generally, this placement, they usually have very pretty voices as well. They are usually pretty reliable, pretty successful, and that's mostly because they have the gift of farsightedness and that intuition to look further down the road and think, okay, how is this decision or this change or this rebellion going to really affect things coming down the road, which is really, really great. Now, to the you know, to the harder side of growing with this placement is that they can have some domestic issues like nobody else, whether it be loss of a spouse or a partner due to a sudden accident, lots of sorrow, things like that, divorce. And these people, when you want to be in a relationship with this kind of placement, they need a lot of space. But think about that. Our musicians, our artists, they need space to create and to be able to go to that very intuitive place and kind of rebel against the norm to be able to create something beautiful. And that's the case for these people as well. Now, they can also, in that, if they feel trapped down, feel like they go towards this completely like anarchist behavior where they're like, I'm rebelling against this relationship, I'm rebelling against, you know, whatever. And they come with their own little set of eccentricities that make them actually even more charming, which kind of stinks. So when they have this placement though, they usually find themselves in really unusual relationships where you're like, oh, I would have never thought to put that together, but it's always kind of interesting. But as they're growing in this placement and they grow into that intuition and that farsightedness, they come to see how they can use that rebelliousness of Uranus and the beauty of Libra and actually put it together and make effective change on the world going forward. And it's usually in their smaller communities that they do that. So when we're looking at the mysteriousness of the Uranus in Scorpio placement, this is a placement that honestly, they're blunt. They are not afraid to be aggressive. They're not afraid to rebel. They have this deepness and this depth to them, and there's detail-orientedness to them that is very unafraid to challenge the unconventional or to challenge the conventional or other people. This is also, we have to remember, it's a placement of, you know, with Scorpio being sex and death. These are experiences that are very, very intense, so they're not afraid of it. They're not afraid to take this Uranus energy and run with it and do things different out in the world and have these different experiences. Now, these people are usually, they can be very mechanically minded as well. They're usually pretty good at technology as well. And the other things about them is that they are secretive. They tend to be very accident prone and accident in the fatal kind of way. When we look at this kind of placement in chart, we look at, you know, can you cross the street? Things like that. It can be something that seems so basic and turns into this huge fatal accident or illness and things like that. The other thing is with this position, relationships can be really, really interesting, sometimes really volatile. Uncontrollable is a really good word for it as well, because sometimes in this position, especially if it's not developed or it's not maturing, it can be like really, really hot and passionate one minute and really, really cool the next minute. And sometimes you're not sure which direction you're going with that and where the energy is coming from. Now, the other thing that this placement really does tend to struggle with is they struggle with wanting to like grow up and mature. You know what I mean? They avoid these like growth things because even though they're not afraid to go and make people uncomfortable or journey into the uncomfortable, when it comes to being uncomfortable themselves, they really have a hard time with it. So what's wise in this position is to really take advantage of all of that fearlessness that's there and use it to grow and mature themselves, because when they do, they can have such a far-sighted vision and such a far-sighted view of change for the entire world that usually goes further than they would ever think, and it is super, super effective. So really interesting things about this placement. When we're looking at the Uranus and Sagittarius placement, this is a placement that generally has very, very strong precognitive abilities. They're very intuitive. They can actually have some premonitions that just blow your mind, where you're like, there's no way you could have just known that. It's a very, very psychic space. At the same time, it's also still a very adventurous and rebellious space at the same time. They love information. They love learning new things. They love sharing new things, but they don't always like to do it in a traditional manner. So it's like in this placement, you can see the person really want to learn stuff, really want to be in school, but be really frustrated at how rigid and how structured traditional education is. They feel like they need something like hack schooling. And if you haven't heard of that, it's just schooling where you get out in the world, basically. It's a different kind of learning. And they really will excel at these kinds of things. Because of this too, because of the world trying to be so strict and trying to be so rigid in how things get done, it can help them have really erratic behavior where they're like, no, I am just, it's a revolution all the time. It's a rebellion all the time, until they're in a space where it's just kind of like their home, they're out, they're adventuring, and then they love science, they love philosophy. You can see them just really changing worldviews with some things that they've got going on. But this is another one, our sign placements as well. That it's very hard for them to want to grow up or to see anyone else's side of the story. They're very good at seeing their own, but it's very hard for them to see the other person's side of the story. But as this placement gets to mature and grow and really see, you know, the full weight of its gifts come to fruition, all the vision, the precognitive dreams and visions they have really become life-changing for not only them, but the people in their own little communities. People with the Uranus in Capricorn placement are generally very ambitious. They do take on those qualities of the little goat, which is really amazing. They can tend to be perceived as being very serious or very conservative, very responsible. These are our responsible people. These people, because they can be perceived as so serious though, it's almost a shock when they're ready to like go against tradition or go against the grain, because this placement is really very happy to kind of like toe the line, which is not a very Uranian kind of trait, but really when we see it in the very grounded Capricorn, I think it can be really exciting. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be erratic or eccentric, because they can. And sometimes where you really see these eccentricities coming out is in business. They are like, nope, we need to change our strategy. We need to have a whole new plan of attack if we're going to be successful here. So that makes them very good in business. And they can usually see like problems or trends or issues coming way before they actually arrive. So that also makes them very, you know, they have some good foresight as well. Now, I have to tell you that they do have a fighter streak. These two energies together really can be very quarrelsome. So they do tend to have issues with keeping jobs, not because they're not good at their jobs, but because they think that they're so much better, and they will fight their way if they think that their system or their strategy or their methodology is a lot better than what's already being presented. They can also be a little bit restless and impulsive, so they do have to think before they speak, think before they act, and things like that. These people are very good in positions too, though, that require interaction or trust with the public. And they're also usually very good at electric stuff and stuff that has to do with like aerial view or aerial vision or aerial travel or things like that. So this is just a little bit interesting about this placement. You wouldn't think with as ultra conservative as this can really come off that they are as erratic as they can be, but they definitely can be with this placement for sure. The Uranus in Aquarius placement is a very comfortable, natural placement. So unlike some of Uranus and some of the other signs that aren't used to the eccentricity and the erratic behaviors of Uranus, Aquarius is very familiar with them, being co-ruled by Uranus. So this is a really natural, comfortable placement for Uranus and Aquarius to work together. And they do exactly what they're built to do. They make these great strides at wanting to take care of humanity and helping to change humanity. They are nicely intuitive, which also helps give this very original and this is what our community and this is what our life needs right now, so we need to move towards it. You can generally find people with this placement too being in positions of service. They really do like being of service to other people, especially as this position matures a little bit. Now, of course, they can be erratic, of course, as we know of Aquarius, as we know of this Uranus energy, and they can have difficulties with who to hang out with and who to spend time with. They have naturally some issues with who to surround themselves with, and then they get overwhelmed because people are or are not exactly the right fit for them, and then they kind of explode, and it's even more erratic then as well. And this placement, of course, as is natural to Aquarius, is not afraid to flip the world upside down, change it, change the thinking, and they're not afraid to do that with their friend and lover zone either. But this is actually a very, very comfortable planet positioning in this sign on its own. The Uranus in Pisces placement is very much so a mystical, occult, imaginary, fantasy kind of placement. And it's actually really nice because in this way that they're so intuitive, they are our phenomena creators, right? Like when it's like, oh my gosh, this is the latest spiritual awakening and the latest spiritual new age, in quotes, awareness that's coming about. They have a great space to help create that because they are also ruled by so much imagination that it helps them actually be visionary. And Uranus is working very comfortably with this energy because Uranus just wants to shake things up, just wants to make it different. And it doesn't really care about what kind of difference necessarily. You know, it gets its grounding about what kind of difference it cares about from other planets. But here, Uranus is happy to play in the illusion, play in the imagination, see the vision out with these people. And ultimately what happens is these people in this placement tend to be very good at helping people get to the other side of delusions and fantasies back into reality, especially if this placement is a little bit more mature. But they most certainly can be unpredictable and erratic. They can be very, very flirty in this placement. But imagine if you're hanging out in the world of fantasy, it's a very flirty place. Now, one thing about them too is that they kind of can hold on to this feeling with so much intuition and stuff like that, that it's like, oh my gosh, when is the next shoe gonna drop? When's the next piece of drama coming? They have this like kind of doomsday feeling within them, and it's very hard for them to get rid of them until they start living in more of a positive space and they learn to, you know, kind of be on that mental diet where it's like, yes, this is a crappy thought, I'm replacing it with something that's beautiful and positive. But they really too, in the way that they're so worried about that, they can help other people get calm and not worry so much about if doom is coming for them as well. So it's a really nice placement. I think it's very, not every placement and not every person in the world needs to be greeted with Mars energy, you know, to get the point. It can be very Uranus and Pisces, softer, more gentle, more fantasy, and helps people see the realities and move towards their greatest good. So that's just a little bit about this placement. They tend to also be, they do want to escape from reality, but they do their best to stay in it, especially as they're, you know, maturing a little bit more. So